Hello and welcome back to a beginner's guide to the world of darkness. This time I'm going to be talking about the Camarilla. And mostly that's because having now covered vampire, mage, and werewolf, I realized that of these games, the one that I want to cover the most starting out is vampire. As much as I would love to delve into mage or delve into werewolf, I think vampire is the one that is easiest to explain without a ton of backstory. Problems with mage and werewolf is that basically everything requires a ton of lore to explain. Like, it's impossible to talk about how werewolves see the world without giving like 1,000 years of lore to explain their positions. And it's really hard to talk about any one mage tradition without being like, and this is where they came from. Vampire is, for better or worse, sort of separate from that. Like, there's a little bit of lore that we're going to have to talk about. But by and large, I can talk about how you should run a Camarilla game without giving, like, 50 minutes of lore. Because I don't want these to be lore videos. The thing that I set out to do when I started making these episodes is I wanted to give sort of a guide on how do you play this. How do you, as a player or as a storyteller, take all of this information and use it to make an effective game or an effective character. As I said in my video, a lot of videos about the world of darkness are very dense, in that there's a lot of information and there's a lot of lore, and it's overwhelming if you're a new player. My opinion on lore and kind of doing videos about it is, if you want lore, you can just read the source books. All of the lore is available to you. Or if you want the Cliff Notes version of lore, for the most part, you can read the wikis. Because most of the wikis, I think, are fairly well updated and cited. That's one thing I actually like about the White Wolf wiki or the Vampire the Masquerade wiki. They use footnotes, and so they cite the books where they got their information. But yeah, my thinking is that if you really want lore, like, you can read the lore yourself, and I think it's presented in a way that's much better than I could personally explain. But when it comes to actually, like, how do I run a game, how do I, like, make sure that all this works, how do I take this information and apply it, I think that's lacking in a number of ways. Just because when you're dealing with a lot of dense lore, it can be hard to translate that into a fun experience for your players. But yeah, that's my kind of goal and my kind of thinking. We're going to be talking about the Camarilla. And the reason why I'm focusing on the Camarilla is that if you're running a Vampire the Masquerade game, especially as a new player or a new storyteller, you're probably going to be running a Camarilla game. Now, I am going to be working under the assumption that you're using the old World of Darkness Camarilla. Okay, New World of Darkness kind of says that the Camarilla didn't work out and changes a bunch of the lore and setting. And we're not talking about the New World of Darkness. And I'm also not talking about 5th edition, which is their anniversary edition update to the lore, which is pretty terrible, all things considered. I'm using the revised edition, and I'm going under the assumption that nothing was ever added to it, because all of the additions are kind of garbage. I hate to say it, but they're all kind of garbage. So we're going to be working with the Old World of Darkness Revised Edition books. That's what we're working with. And all of the information that I'm giving should be available in the books that I've already recommended. So if you have the player's guide and the rules guide and whatever clan book that you're using, you're set. You probably don't need any more books beyond that, unless you really want to. One thing I'm going to continue to harp on is, if you're a new player, focus on a small number of books to start out with. Don't try to read like all of the random side lore that you probably don't need, because you're just going to overwhelm yourself. So we have a couple things we need to talk about. First and foremost, we have to deal with a little bit of lore to explain what the Camarilla is, why does it exist, and why is it important for players and storytellers to know about it. First things first, we need to go all the way back to Cain. He of the Bible, he of the slayer of Abel. Cain, when he starts creating his kids and founding his city, he gives them 6 traditions. Says, you guys need to follow these rules to survive. Pretty straightforward. However, the third generation, once they rebel against the second generation and kind of go their separate ways, are somewhat, how should I put this, lax in teaching their kids that they need to follow the rules. And whether or not the rules are being followed kind of comes down to individual vampires for a very long time. There are vampires who rule openly. In fact, the Shemits, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the flesh crafters, the guys in Eastern Europe who make war ghouls, yeah, they just rule openly. Like, they're not even hiding the fact that they're vampires. And in many places, vampires are either not hiding the fact that they're vampires, or, at the very least, are not very subtle about the power they wield. And this kind of goes on for, like, thousands of years, until roughly, like, between 1200 and 1400. Before this point, all the various clans are independent. They don't work with each other unless they personally feel like they need to. There's no real structure to vampires in general. Even within the clans, by and large, there's no structure. It is individuals doing whatever they want, enforcing their power however they want, deciding when and how to enforce the rules based on their own whims. As you can imagine, this is very chaotic. As you can probably imagine, it leaves a lot of things to be desired when everything kind of hits the fan. And 2 things happen in question that forces a change in thinking from creatures that, by their nature, are not quick to change. The first is the quote-unquote burning times, which basically every clan suffers from, by which I mean the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition was not nearly as extreme as most people imagine it to be. That doesn't mean that people weren't burned at the stake, but most of the images and accounts that we have of the Inquisition that people imagine are written by the people being persecuted. And much like how the Boston Massacre images that Americans are familiar with are not really good depictions of what actually happened, most of the woodcuts and things like that are intentionally embellished to make them seem even more inhumane and psychotic, essentially. So in real life, the Inquisition was bad, and it burned lots of people, but it wasn't as bad as depicted, is the way I'm getting at. Not as many people died as they made it sound like. The image that people get when they think of the Inquisition is like millions upon millions of people were burned at the stake. In reality, across all of the years, of like the century that the Inquisition was active, you're looking at somewhere between 30,000 to 300,000 people have probably been like killed, tortured, imprisoned by the Inquisition. So all of Europe, somewhere between 30,000 to 300,000, which is a fairly good range, but we're not talking millions upon millions of people. The World of Darkness, however, is not the real world. And the World of Darkness takes the popular perception and goes, yeah, that's actually understated. Okay? So in the World of Darkness, because it's dark fantasy, it goes with the idea that the Inquisition was just burning, like, whole cities worth of people. Like, constantly. Darkness, is just burning literally everybody that they can find who even looks slightly odd. Okay? And when we're talking millions of people, that's basically how the World of Darkness views the Inquisition, and how vampires view the Inquisition. Lots of old vampires who were very used to just doing their own thing suddenly had to contend with the fact that mortals were just seeking them out and destroying them, like wholesale. And then them. But it probably on its own would not have been enough to change their behavior. The second major event that comes right after the Inquisition is the Anarch Revolt. And essentially what happens is a lot of young vampires sort of look around and they say, you know, our elders are treating us like shit. And they're basically using us as scapegoats to burn for them. All of these things that they're enforcing upon us are way out of date. You have people who don't even speak the languages of mortals in this day and age claiming dominion over cities and towns that they don't even recognize. You have people going in and out of torpor on a regular basis and waking up like hundreds of years after they went to sleep and then claiming dominion over things by right of birth, essentially. As a result, there is at first a sort of murmuring, which then turns into full-on revolt, wherein lots of quote-unquote younger vampires at that age, who would now be like over 1,000 years old, just straight up rebel against their sires, committing diablerie, which is to say that they drink the souls of their sires. They burn them, destroy them, take over their territories, force them from their havens, essentially just ignoring all of the traditions that Cain passed down because they view them as outdated and, in some cases, counterproductive. And so what you have is actually open warfare between older vampires and younger vampires. And this goes on for a very long time. Well, I guess you could say it's a very long time in mortal years. In vampire years, it's actually not that long. We're talking like 50 years of conflict. During which time, older vampires kind of lose their shit and get super, afraid of everything that's going on all at once. Everything that they thought was made out of stone turns out to be really not. Like, all the things that they took for granted really turn out to be flimsy. And so, facing down destruction, not just of their own lives, but of the world that they knew, the elders of the various clans get together and sort of sit down and kind of hash out an idea of what they're supposed to do. Because they all kind of realize that separate, they're all going to die. Well, die permanently, I guess you could say. But together, they might have a chance of succeeding. And keep in mind, most of these vampires hate each other and have spent thousands of years at this point fighting each other. The elders are very used to doing their own thing. They're very used to being independent, and they're not too happy about coming together and, having to follow rules that are set by other people. But they also don't want to face final death by their children, and they don't want to be burned by the Inquisition. So clearly something needs to change, and that fear drives them to hash out what would be the Camarilla. practice, the Camarilla is mostly the same as the rules that Cain set down. Essentially, this is a sudden rediscovering of all of these rules that Cain set out and told them these are the things you need to do if you want to survive, that they all kind of flaunted and ignored for a few thousand years. In practice, what ends up happening is the elders together defeat the anarchs, and they're like, look, you're going to have to listen to us. You're going to have to follow us. Here are the rules that are now going to govern everyone's lives. And some of the anarchs are like, yeah, we'd like to stop dying and being destroyed by our elders. And some of the anarchs go, yeah, that's all bullshit. And the ones that say it's bullshit go and form the Sabbat. And that's how these two, organizations come to be. Talking about the Sabbat today, we're talking about the Camarilla. Now, in practice, the traditions are enforced essentially based around the whims of the elders, or in this case, the princes, that rule over various domains. That hasn't changed, with the exception of the first tradition, the Masquerade. And yes, I am going to explain all of the traditions, so you don't have to worry about it. With the existence of the Camarilla, the Masquerade becomes extremely important and much more enforced in a way that it wasn't before. The Masquerade becomes perhaps the most important of the traditions, and everyone from elders on down is expected to abide by this tradition. So what is the Masquerade? The Masquerade is essentially a rule that says, don't do anything to reveal the fact that you're a vampire to mortals. Mortals cannot know that vampires exist, and never do anything that reveals our existence to them. And in my Beginner's Guide to Vampire the Masquerade, what counts as a Masquerade violation varies wildly. So there are things that are very small, like, somebody saw you feeding. That cover up, and so that's a much lower penalty than, say, somebody watched you pick up and throw a car on camera, which is much harder to cover up, and so comes with a much harsher punishment. Furthermore, the role of the prince is essentially to punish anyone who violates the Masquerade. That is to say, anyone who reveals vampires to mortals must be punished, and the person who's supposed to do that is the prince. If something happens in your domain, it's the job of the person who owns the domain to deal with that problem. See a kind of self-justification with the Camarilla, where it's like, why does the Camarilla exist? To punish those who violate the rules of the Camarilla. That's how this shakes out. And the surprise is, this works. In fact, this works very well. It works so well that many elders who initially really hated the idea of being subservient, I guess you could say, to somebody else's rules, find that this is actually much better than doing before, because it creates a permission structure for all of the things that they wanted. Now, whenever they demand things from younger vampires, they can claim, these are the rules of the Camarilla. It's not my personal whims that are telling you to do this. This is just how things are. These are the rules that everybody has to follow. Now that we've covered, we can kind of cover the other 5 traditions, which sort of make up the rest of the Camarilla, or more accurately, make up the structure of the Camarilla. So, we know why it exists. The Camarilla exists to enforce the Masquerade more effectively. But what is the actual structure? Like, how to make up vampire society? The second tradition is the domain. And the domain is ostensibly the area in which a vampire rules, which previously was essentially however large a territory one could enforce their will over. As you can imagine, this created lots of infighting. With the existence of the Camarilla, the domains become much more structured in the sense that various princes are given official, quote-unquote, license to rule over their territories, and their territories become essentially set in stone. They do change over time, but by and large, a domain is only considered a domain if the various Camarilla powers say, yes, this is your domain, you are allowed to rule over it, this is your territory, and we trust you to, enforce the rules of the Camarilla in this area. Now, this doesn't change very much. It essentially just draws lines on maps, if you want to think of it that way, and makes what was unofficial official. Vampires who claimed dominion over cities and towns and areas before now can claim that the Camarilla supports their right to rule over these territories, and when they take actions, they are doing so with the permission of the Camarilla itself. Ostensibly, every city has a prince, every sort of region has a prince. Depending on how popular it is, there may be a very large domain or a very small domain. So, for example, individual large cities like New York or Boston or London might have a prince just for that city. In some areas that are less populous, let's say the back country of France, the rural areas of Wales, a prince might rule over a large swath of territory that encompasses many different cities, simply because there just aren't a lot of vampires or mortals there to rule over. But the domain is extremely important because it sets up the rest of the rules that need to be enforced, not just the masquerade. This to the third tradition / third rule, which is the rule of progeny. What that means is that you're not allowed to make new vampires unless the elders, or in this case, the prince, says that you can. Okay? This is extremely important for the paranoid elders who have just watched all of their younger vampires revolt against them and start destroying them. Essentially, a lot of elders before this point didn't really care how many younger vampires were sired. They essentially just kind of were like, okay, I sired you, you sired somebody. I'm not really paying attention to my great-grandsire and who they're siring. It's not really important to me. The Anarch Revolt changes that. The Anarch Revolt reveals that there are lots of young vampires, and in numbers, they are very dangerous. And so, with the creation of the Camarilla, the rule of progeny becomes more important. And this changes from the various elders of clans to the princes of cities. If you want to sire a new vampire within the territory of the prince must give his permission. Again, this is debatable in terms of how much it's enforced. Some princes enforce this very strictly, to the point where they will destroy vampires who break this rule, not just the kids, but the sires. And in some cases, they don't enforce this rule at all. But along with this rule comes another rule where the Camarilla basically say there needs to be no more than one vampire for every 100,000 mortals. That's kind of the rule, essentially. Moving beyond that, the Camarilla moves to kind of create a system of accountability between vampires to make it easier to enforce all of the other rules. This is just an enforcing of the next tradition, which is the tradition of accounting. Basically what it says is, when you sire a kid, until that kid is officially declared independent, everything that they do is your responsibility as the sire. So, essentially, if you sire a mortal and that mortal breaks the masquerade, that's on you as the sire, because it's your job as their parent to teach them all the things they need to know. And this is, again, just a way of enforcing a kind of accountability between vampires so they don't sire a bunch of people willy-nilly. Again, the Camarilla sort of exists to enforce the rules of the Camarilla and nothing else. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of punishment, essentially. The next rule is kind of, again, designed to protect the people who are a part of the Camarilla and no one else. And it's the tradition of hospitality, which in the Camarilla just means when you enter somebody's domain, it's your job to announce that you've entered it. Because before, vampires would just kind of wander around in some cases, especially the gangrel. But the Malkavians, and in some cases, even the other clans who were more prone to sticking in one place, they would just wander into new territories and start doing whatever they wanted. The Camarilla says this is bad and creates conflict that we don't want. But it's a way to control younger vampires as well. It controls them in the sense that it makes it impossible for them to wander into new territory and start doing things for themselves. If they go to a new city, they have to declare to whoever rules that city that they have entered it, so that everybody knows that they are there. There are no more secrets about who is where or doing what. And finally, the last tradition, which is very clearly enforced by the Camarilla to protect the elders, is the tradition of destruction, which simply states that the right to kill another vampire comes down to the elder, or in the case of the Camarilla, comes down to the prince. In other words, if you want to destroy a rival, the only one who's allowed to decide that is whoever rules the domain. And as you can imagine, this exists only to keep younger vampires from destroying their elders, and it allows a system to be put in place that allows punishment if anyone breaks the rule. So, if a younger vampire decides that he doesn't like his sire and he destroys his sire, this now gives a system where the prince can say, he broke the rules, I can now punish him officially, even though he's not a part of my clan, and otherwise it would be none of my business. Again, pretty easily see how much the Anarch Revolt scared the hell out of the elders to make them sort of institute these rules across all of Europe and the Middle East. Now, it is worth noting that not every clan is a part of the Camarilla. Only some of the clans are a part of the Camarilla, not just because the La Sombra and the Shemits decided to form the Sabbat on their own, but because some clans just weren't invited. The Tremere were invited, the Gangrel were invited, the Ventru, the Malkavians, the Toreador, all of these, kind of bigger clans were brought into the fold, whereas the Assamites were very much not invited. And ostensibly this is kind of a who's in and who's out sort of system. In terms of rules, technically speaking, all vampires, regardless of whether they personally swear allegiance to the Camarilla, are a part of the Camarilla. You can't leave, okay? You can't break the rules and claim that you never agreed to them, sort of thing. This is why later on in the lore, the Gangrel deciding ostensibly to leave is such a problem, because, how do you leave a system like this? that should not be possible because everybody is a part of the system, whether they agree to the system or not. It is a system that allows for punishment of people who break the system. That's the beginning and the end of it. So there's no way for you to leave it because you're a part of it simply by existing in terms of how the Camarilla thinks. The Anarchs are constantly a sort of thorn in the side of the Camarilla because the Camarilla officially says, well, the Anarchs aren't their own thing. So they're still, like, part of the Camarilla, even though the Anarchs say that they're not. The Anarchs very openly say, we are not a part of the Camarilla and we're not going to follow its rules. And the Camarilla is like, that's great, you're still a part of the Camarilla though, and we still reserve the right to punish you based on our own rules. So now I think we've the lore out of the way, although a lot of this isn't necessarily lore as much as it is systems. I think most people, players and storytellers, can kind of listen to this and go, oh, okay, I understand how, like, a vampire might respond to these things. I understand how my character or my characters would exist under this structure, how they would view being a part of this structure, how they would view having to deal with these rules and sort of hurdles that they have to jump over. One basic questions that every vampire character sort of has to ask is, how does your character view the masquerade? How does your character view the rules? Do they view them as, these are ironclad laws that everybody has to follow? Or do they view them as, these are annoyances that we're only going to follow if we think we're going to get punished? Sort of thing. As I said, there's a lot of leeway as storytellers and as characters, because a lot of these rules are enforced based on the personal whims of whatever prince rules over whatever domain. And the ability to punish rule breakers really comes down to how strong is the prince, or how much does the prince pay attention. That's really it. Beyond that, though, are other things which kind of allow for role-playing, I guess you can say. The basic structure of most cities is that you have the prince on top. The prince is the most powerful vampire in terms of how much influence they have, how much power they personally have, how much they are able to convince everybody else to listen to them. That's really it. Beneath them, however, are primogen. What's a primogen? Ostensibly, a primogen is just the most powerful member of whatever clan is in the city. So, let's say you have, I don't know, Washington, D.C. or something, and the prince is a Ventru. But there are lots of other vampires from other clans in Washington, D.C. So you would appoint a Malkavian primogen, and the Malkavian primogen's job is to keep all the other Malkavians in line. He is their representative, but he is also the one who's responsible for managing and paying attention to all of the other members of his clan. And depending on where you are and how many of a certain clan exist in that area, a primogen might rule over more vampires than the prince does, or they might be the only one of their clan in an area. For some clans, like the Gangrel, it's not, like, uncommon for a Gangrel primogen to be the only Gangrel in the surrounding area. Like, your job is to essentially be the advocate for your kind, but you're the only member of your kind in this domain. So you're basically just, like, the advocate for yourself. And again, depending on the prince, depending on where you are, a primogen might be a honorary position that has no power, or it might be an extremely important position that confers as much, or in some cases more power than the role of prince does. Again, this opens up a lot of role-playing opportunities, because let's say you're a character, you are, I don't know, a Tremere, and you're very young, but the Tremere Primogen has a lot of jobs for you, which then will endear you to this very powerful individual within this domain. Okay? Or you are a Bruja, and the Tremere Primogen asks you for favors, and down the line you can call in favors from the Primogen, who controls a lot of different things, and thus has power that you now have access to. It should not be understated that the Camarilla did not stop the quote-unquote jihad from going on. The jihad, by the way, as I alluded to in my Beginner's Guide to Vampire the Masquerade, is just the term that they use for vampires fighting vampires over all kinds of stuff. Big and small. Okay? Sometimes it's over absolutely nothing, and 2,000-year-old vampires are pissed off about something that no one else can remember. Sometimes we're talking blood feuds that arise from very serious infractions. But the Camarilla did not stop these sort of feuds from going on. It just sort of codified them and made them more official, I guess you can say. So now, instead of, like, having a bunch of powerful vampires openly fighting each other, now they all have to sort of come together and pretend to be civil while they all, like, fight each other in the shadows using proxies. It's all very Victorian Age. There's a reason why vampires really love the Victorian Age, and why I think it's such a great setting for vampire, because that's sort of the ideal of the setting. Like, the idealized setting is all of these really powerful bastards in a room together drinking blood and talking about the kids these days, while in the background they're having those kids fight bloody civil wars for power and influence on their behalf. So let's go now. Let's delve a little bit further into this for players. As I said much earlier, every vampire is considered a part of the Camarilla, whether they personally agree with it or not. Generally speaking, new players should just assume that they're a part of the Camarilla, because the Camarilla rules over a majority of vampire domains. And how much freedom you kind of have within that domain really comes down to, like, how big it is and how many vampires there are. Okay? So, like, cities like New York, you know, there are a lot of vampires, and you probably are not going to meet the prince very often. You're probably going to be meeting with whatever Primogen rules whatever area, you know, or you're probably going to be interacting with various entities that act on behalf of other entities. As players, you're either going to want to make characters that respond directly to these vampires, or at the very least are members of their, like, direct family. And there's a good reason for that. If you're a new player, it's very easy to come up with stories if you're like, yeah, the Primogen is my great-grandsire, and so I have a reason to support his interests. Or I am, like, directly responsible for repaying him for whatever debts I owe as being his child, kind of thing. It makes it easy, if you are a player, to sort of come up with basic stories while you're still finding your feet. As a storyteller, you should immediately decide what prince is in charge of the area, what clan they're a part of, and what they want. Like, you need to decide, okay, is the prince of this territory, like, super neurotic in terms of enforcing the rules? Are they lax enforcing the rules? Do they enforce some rules more than others? Because that's going to change the character of your game. So, here's a good example. If the prince in general doesn't enforce, say, the rule of hospitality very much, the rule that says, hey, every new vampire needs to announce themselves when they enter the territory, you might have stories that deal with the fact that lots of outside vampires are wandering into your territory and causing problems because they're not announcing themselves. Or you might decide, okay, this vampire is super strict in enforcing the masquerade, and so every little infraction comes with a very hefty punishment. And how does that, like, harm the players? How do the players deal with that they have to constantly feel like they're walking on eggshells because the prince is a paranoid lunatic who is trying to clamp down on any possible infraction of the rules? All right? Or one of the best kind of stories that you can run with brand new vampires, the vampire kid in question, the player character, has been sired without permission by the prince. They have violated the rule of progeny. And so the kid is technically illegal. And so the prince has the right, as prince, to destroy them, if they so choose. Does the prince do this? Well, in the case of a roleplay, the prince would obviously decide not to destroy the player character outright, because that would be a very short roleplay. But why does the prince not do this? Does the prince demand, say, like, recompense for ruling, I guess you could say, leniently in the case of the player character? There's a lot of things you can do. The rules sound very stifling, but the rules also create a lot of story opportunities. Okay? Especially for Camarilla games. This is also why I say that you should start with a Camarilla game, because the rules exist to create stories. The rules exist to make it easier for storytellers to tell stories and easier for player characters to roleplay. I think part of it also allows for some restrictions on players that's good for them. So, here's a good example. When you're sitting down and saying, okay, we're writing a story where we, as the player characters, have been given a job by the prince to punish somebody for a violation of the masquerade. Okay, so let's say some Malkavian is out there and they are openly violating the masquerade. We need to cover it up and capture them and take them to the prince. You are, as a vampire who has to follow the rules, limited in how you're allowed to do this. Like, when you're trying to cover this up, you can't break the masquerade yourself. Okay, you can't deal with a masquerade violation by making more masquerade violations. Okay, you are not allowed to destroy them because you don't have the right of destruction. So you have to take them alive, or you have to take them, like, in torpor somehow. You have to do it in a way that doesn't attract attention, and if you do attract attention, you have to cover it up. So this gives a sort of structure to the players of how do we deal with this problem without going immediately to, let's just fight. I guess this kind of goes under the rule of, like, dominant strategy. Like, in games, the rule of dominant strategy is if you give the player a win button, that's all they're going to use. Okay? And in roleplay like this, the win button is combat. Okay? The win button is, let's just punch it out. Okay? And so the Camarilla games, because of the rules, force the players to use other tools. It forces them to find other ways to solve problems. It forces them to work together to solve problems. And as a storyteller, you should be thinking about, okay, how do I present problems to them that they need to work out? All right. As players, you need to think of, how does my character work around the rules? How does my player deal with their night-to-night lives without breaking the rules? Okay? So let's talk even more specifically to individuals for a moment. Individuals might have everything from influence in various different power centers to having their own herds or ghouls. And all of these things are subject to the masquerade. You have to be careful in how you use these things. So let's give a quick example. Let's say you have police influence. Okay? You have either mortal friends or acquaintances or people who owe you favors in police departments. Okay? How you develop those contacts is subject to the masquerade. So if you show up and you start using your disciplines, or you start, ghouling individuals in positions of power, you have to make sure that everything you do doesn't violate the masquerade. If you want to, say, develop political influence, if you want to develop resources that you can then call on later, you have to do it in a way that doesn't violate any of the rules. So you can't just embrace the mayor, okay? You can't just be like, I'm going to go find the police chief and I'm going to make him my ghoul, okay? Because you're going to break the rules. And obviously, there are, ways that other people can find out that you broke the rules, okay? So it's like, as an individual, if you have goals, like if you're a Ventru and you're like, okay, I was embraced because I was a middle manager and I was really good at my job, but I want to move up in the world. I want to make more money. I want to have more assets. How do I do that? You can't just go around dominating rich people, okay? Because that's going to make a stink. And people are going to be kind of, aware that you as an individual are strange, okay? That's the thing about Dominate that I think the books are a little lax on. I haven't really talked about disciplines because I don't really want to talk about, functions. I don't really want to talk about, mechanics too much and get too in the weeds. But in general, one of the flaws of Dominate is that it's sort of brute force in the fact that people who have been dominated might find it kind of odd in hindsight when they think about it, when they've interacted with you. And too much of it, they kind of turn into, zombies without so if you're dominating them to do complex tasks, other mortals are going to notice. So it's you have to balance out being a vampire with being, a savvy operative, I guess. In game terms, we would call this role playing. You would have to be a good role player. You would have to come up with schemes and come up with ways of getting what you want without resorting immediately to brute force. Because the other thing is you're interacting with other vampires. So in the case of the police chief or the mayor, other vampires probably already control them, or at least want to. So you're immediately, thrust into, dealing with those people. You're immediately thrust into competition with other vampires. And so that is what creates stories in the Camarilla, is this sort of behind-the-scenes constant power play. And that's the sort of thing that you as a player and as a storyteller need to be thinking about. That's the stuff that's going to give you memorable gameplay. Because it doesn't necessarily have to be, super big or super important. It doesn't always have to be, end of the world, domination of the city level, stories. It could be something really small. It could be as small as, I don't know, Malkavian has a bug up his butt and he wants to control the local Burger King, and that Burger King is already owned by someone else, or is owned, or I don't know, maybe all of the franchises in the city are owned by someone else, and they're not too happy that you're muscling in on their territory. And so the entire storyline is about how the battle for this one Burger King has spiraled out of control, and city block by city block level fighting of various vampire like, that's how you can run a game. A game doesn't necessarily have to be huge. You can run an entire game about the vampires fighting over a single city block. Alright? It all comes down to how creative you are, but also how you, as a player, define your character. This is why I like Camarilla games, because Camarilla games allow for a lot of character-centric plots. Okay? More so than the Sabbat. And when I do a Sabbat episode, I will talk about this. But by and large, Camarilla games are very good at giving players and storytellers the structure that they need to run, I guess you could say, more complicated games, or more in-depth games, deeper games. I'm not sure the right way to put it. But essentially, do more than just combat. Do more than just the players have a problem and they want to hit it with the biggest stick possible. Camarilla games are really good at avoiding that outcome. That doesn't mean that there isn't combat, and it doesn't mean that you can't run a combat-centric Camarilla game, but Camarilla games give you the structure to run more kinds of games, I guess you can say. And that's really all I have to say about the Camarilla as an organization, without delving into, like, individual clans or, like, individual cities and the like. So, that's the Camarilla. I will see you all next time. I'll probably do the Sabbat next. So, look out for that. See y'all later.